All right, so let's get reading. A defense of Hannah Arendt's reflections on Little Rock. So please take a look at my introduction video before this, by Daniel Cole. In this paper, I will attempt to defend Arendt's usage of socio-political distinctions in her reflections on Little Rock, demonstrating that not only is it tenable, but also helpful. After distinguishing between her infamous distinction between the social and the political spheres, I will use the notions of power, which is compatible with political freedom, and force, which is not, to analyze the strategy of governmentality in forced integration. What I hope to show is that although schools are utmost political importance, governmental force cannot solve social prejudice, and it cannot legitimately be used outside of the sphere of establishing and protecting legal equality. I will further elucidate Arendt's illustrative passage on how integration effort might politically engage political problems of exclusion and inequality in schools without having to resort to force to solve socio-political problems, social problems, and without reducing politics to instrumental administration. Insofar as Arendt writes about the past, she does so monumentally, that is, not as one whose chief concern is to establish the continuity of history, but in order to awaken the dead by revealing action. Her engagement is not to destroy, but to dismantle the past and to see history's victories naked and strip progress of necessity. Jerome Hom. Throughout her theoretical corpus, Arendt is concerned with the political reality of freedom, as opposed to a metaphysical doctrine that holds true of individuals even in isolation. This concern for freedom was present in her article Reflections on Little Rock, wherein Arendt criticizes desegregationists for their use of government to achieve their ends because, according to her, such a project was simply a means to improve their social standing, when governments should be established to protect our political space of freedom by acting in the name of legal equality. Reflections is a controversial, even when published, has garnered enduring criticism from Arendt's critics and supporters alike, calling into questions Arendt's core notion of freedom. Some of Arendt's critics have taken Arendt's stance vis-a-vis desegregation to stem from her distinction between the political and the social realms. Some of her defenders have claimed Arendt simply misapplied her own theoretical categories of her analysis of Little Rock. No, she didn't. I wonder who kind of makes this claim, because this is a mistake, right? Even Catherine Gynes says that her theoretical categories are consistent. So her theoretical categories are consistent, and we're going to see why that is important. Because her work in the human condition is incredibly important to understand what's actually going on, what her actual arguments are, and whether or not she is racist. What has most often been taken for granted regarding the essay is that Arendt was wrong in her analysis of the situation, and what was most debated in this extent to which this implicates her broad theoretical framework. My task here will be to offer a recapitulation of Arendt's arguments, supplemented with exegesis from a variety of sources from her corpus, so that we may better see not only to what extent this work implicates her fundamental concepts, but also whether there is anything worth salvaging in one of her most controversial works. There are two major controversial aspects of the work that I will be concerned with analyzing. Namely, I will address Arendt's socio-political distinctions operates vis-a-vis public activity, as well as the claim that equality cannot be enforced in the political as opposed to the social sphere. I'm thinking here of Denzel Washington, who says legislation, and this is Denzel Washington's most Arendtian moment, you cannot legislate love. So please look at that. In this paper, I will attempt to point out Arendt's main insights in Reflections on Little Rock is that there is a serious limitation to trying to fix the world without emphasis on dialogue. Perfect. Although it would be admitted that Arendt's language of the illegitimacy of government intervention in desegregation should be abandoned, while the landmark integration of Little Rock High School did help to alleviate some of the inequalities of education between white and black families, it did not undermine or eliminate prejudice that animated segregation, which continues to this day, albeit in somewhat different forms. Many would argue that segregation has gotten worse, racism has gotten worse, and that's because we've given the identity politics card to white people to play indiscriminately. The first portion of my paper will be devoted to establishing the distinction between social and the political. The next portion of my paper, I will take the socio-political distinction and apply it to her description of the educational system in her more mature work on schools, the crisis in education. Now, here is the biggest critique that we can have of Arendt, which is that the educational system is not a social space, it's a public space. And this kind of thinking Arendt hadn't basically completed yet. Finally, I will show how Arendt's criticism of the government desegregation in schools stems from her mistrust of social modes of action, discourse, but she not only leaves open, she concretely points to politicized modes of school reform in the very article commentators find so problematic, social and political. It is crucial that we gain clarity on the nature of distinction between social and political as pertains to the government, since Arendt's claim that the government should not enforce equality in schools hinges on it. The implication of Arendt's claim seems to be that the government is political and has no business mixing matters, social matters like schools, but the social and political are modes of speech and action, which means that they have to analyze what government does in order to find out whether it is acting politically or socially. Our biggest hint to refrain from equating government with politics is that Arendt tends to focus on claiming that politics is the realm of freedom. The meaning of politics is freedom. The meaning of politics is freedom. She then elaborates the condition of freedom rather than defining freedom or politics as a kind of institution. The relevant conditions of freedom that I will explain are natality, power, and constitutionality. What we will see in the elaboration of these terms is that politics always make essential references to distinct individuals being seen as such and engaging in dialogue. That is, the enactment of freedom always occurs through dialogical speech that permits persuasion and change. Next, I will flesh out the notion of the social, which stands against the political. Primarily, I will focus on how the social realm ties to instrumental rationality and its compatibility with force and violence are non-dialogical modes of speech and action, and do not create or enrich the in-between space that relates distinct individuals and characterizes the political. By elaborating the social and the political distinction, I will vindicate my claim that they are modes of action and speech, not just unchanging categories designating different realms of political life. Designating different realms of public life. Despite their differences, the social and political always both deal with what is public. Arendt writes the public means, first, that everything that appears in public can be seen and heard by everybody and has the widest possible publicity. And second, the term public signifies the world itself, insofar it is common to all of us and distinguished from our privately owned place in it. Arendt also uses the metaphor of a table to capture what it is that the world does. To live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is located between those who sit around it. The world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time. Now, here you really need to be a Heideggerian scholar here, okay? All of these Arendtian terms come from Heidegger. Heidegger's ideas of being in the world. Heidegger's idea of the Volk. All of these are Heideggerian ideas. In short, people do not live as solipsists or as pure creators and sovereigns over their own dwelling spaces. Not right. They inhabit a world with things that possess their own measure of durability and reality. This world of things also serves to mediate our relationships with one another, since we do not simply appear to one another as naked consciousnesses or as purely biological animals. There's filters. Rather, we meet one another within contexts, determined in no small measure by different kinds of physical space. Schools, town halls, malls, public parks, etc. The political. With this in mind, we turn our attention to political action. On Arendt's understanding, action that embraces novelty is not simply an entertaining aspect of human existence, it is a fundamental condition of human existence, which she terms natality. Arendt writes, The fact that man is capable of action means the unexpected can be expected of him, and that he is able to perform what is infinitely improbable. And this, again, is possible only because each man is unique, so that within each birth, something uniquely comes into this world. This is, again, one of the things that feminist psychology is rooted against. The unique relationship between two people that creates a loving relationship that no other relationship in the world has this kind of love is anti-feminist psychology. It's anti-feminist psychology because, and we're going to be talking about how Arendt is an anti-feminist coming along as well. For Arendt, human beings are not born simply as members of species, but are born as new beginnings whose futures contain unpredictable possibilities. It is Arendt's contention that in political action, humans begin something new, and this beginning of something new is an actualization of the fact that humans are new. That is, they are born into the world that possesses some measure of durability and stability, in terms of which their novelty can appear as such. Amazing. In a world that is constantly changing, what is lasting is ever more important. That's a Heideggerian idea I learned. And in political action, humans can change this durable in-between place that enables action. That is not to say that each person masters her own identity or authors her own action through being. No, that's just an Enlightenment idea. On the contrary, Arendt writes, freedom as related to politics is not a phenomenon of the will. This is anti-Nietzschean. We deal here not with libertarium arbitrium, a freedom of choice between two given things. The traditional conception of will as the locus of freedom, qua sovereignty, is problematic on Arendt's account because, carried to its logical conclusion, it means that we are never more free than when we are alone and able to act only on our own individual strengths. And again, this is against the popular psychology, popular so-called secular neoliberal strong independent black women ideology that we are hearing in every aspect of neoliberal culture today. No, you're not a strong independent anything. You are tied to the world and you owe the world something. You have a duty to respond. You have a duty to volunteer. You have a duty to participate in your community. Of course, we don't live in that community. We live in a neoliberal community of I don't owe you anything culture. This stance for freedom, when it is no longer understood in this traditional sense, is the degree to which humans acting together can bring about some worldly actions that were not simply logical consequences of the preceding state of affairs. This is to say that political freedom allows there to be something new under the proverbial sun. We see that the twofold relationship of freedom to novelty. Freedom is the realization of the novelty inherent in the birth of unique person against the backdrop of mediating a stable world. And it is the ability to set into motion deeds that defy probability and expectation entirely. Deifying probability is what capitalism is all about, and the cost-benefit analysis is all about. And given that political action changes the common world and in-between space, it requires the cooperation of individuals related and separated by the in-between space. I'm thinking about her famous speech about lying, about politics and lying, in relation to all of this, where she is critiquing political science for pretending to be a science when really it's not at all a science, or sociology as a science, or psychology as a science, all of these pseudosciences that go out and create laws based on their pseudoscience. The cooperation of individuals related to one another in a common world through dialogue is what Arendt calls power. Of course, this pseudoscientific information is now making science itself even pseudo. Okay, whatever ideas we had of idealisms, we have pure science, which of course I have my own postmodern critiques against science. I have plenty of postmodern critiques against science. On Arendt's understanding, power exists only insofar as it is actualized, although it is potentially there wherever people share a public space. Strictly speaking, then, power does not require full-fledged freedom in order to be. Power can be non-political or pre-political, as it is in hierarchies and revolutions, respectively. However, Power is necessary for political freedom to appear. Without the cooperation of individuals related to one another through speech in a common world where there can be no freedom to transform or add to that in between space. Arendt further writes of power that power is actualized only where word and deed have not parted company. Now that's sad. Power is actualized only where word and deed have not parted company, where words are not empty and deeds are not brutal, where words are not used to veil intentions but to disclose realities. Man, I would give anything to have an new Arendtian critique of virtue signaling culture today and platforming strawman culture today. It's so sad where we are today. And deeds are not used to violate or destroy, but to establish relations with and create new realities. Say one thing culture, do another thing culture. That's basically what intersectionality imposes upon us. We have to play this game. If we don't, we lose our social capital points. In other words, power is inherently dialogical, but it is not simply communication, it's a mode of speech. Speech that also is doing. Ultimately, an increase in power increases in what people can do. This is a great summary of the human condition. This capacity of power to allow people to act in ways that surpasses the limits of any individual presupposes a plurality of people. That is, power in a narrow sense presupposes that the people it binds together are different. In the case of political power, they are also distinct by virtue of their birth. Compare this idea to the forced commensurability of intersectionality, the forced commensurability, all of the bad analogies between race and class and gender and all these things that are made constantly in our publisher parish capitalist social capital culture. If the modes of association that bind people together do not preserve distinction, then those modes of association are simply not power. Wonderful. That's really interesting. So from an Arendtian perspective, intersectionality is not power. It's not power. It's just force. For instance, force is a capacity to affect some change or another, but one that excludes the distinction of individuals. Arendt writes that force, which we have often used in daily speech as a synonym for violence, especially if violence serves as a means of coercion, should be reserved in a terminological language for the forces of nature or the forces of circumstance. That is, to indicate the energy released by physical or social movements, what we may call social pressures, which are monolithic, encourage conformity, and rely on the sameness of people, rather than their differences, or are a kind of force. Forces can be disparate as economic pressures and fashion trends, and although we may be subjected to a network of forces, some of which are opposing, what is key to remember about them is that they are not dialogical. One cannot change force. One is only affected by force. We're talking about intersectionality here, right? The problem, intersectionality from an Arendtian perspective is not collective power. It's force, right? It's a totalitarian force. The problem with the government desegregation is that it uses the use of force, not power, which, as something which is non-dialogical, cannot create anything new in the world, but can only limit it. Now, we're going to have to talk about Salah Ben Habib and Salah Ben Habib's critique of Arendt, which I think is probably the best critique of Arendt, which is that she assumes some sort of idealism in dialogue. Now, my counter critique to Salah Ben Habib is a Zizekian critique. Zizek says, if you get rid of the idealism, all you have left is nightmare. And that's basically the cyberpunk reality we live in. No more idealism of the public sphere and no more idealism of the family, of the temple. Only neoliberal social relationships. The question we will turn to later is that if there can be political change in schools, and if so, how? Political change in schools. The emphasis on distinction leads us to a second, somewhat more confusing distinction of condition of freedom, namely what I call constitutionality. In this article, Arendt's Constitutional Politics, Waldron writes, this constitutional structure is the aspect of the in-between, political structure as something that both separates people from one another and relates them to one another. Like a table or a seating plan, a constitution separates and relates us by putting us in different seats in one another's presence. In order to understand the way constitutionality is enabling condition of freedom, we must necessarily distinguish freedom from liberty. For Arendt, mere liberty is purely negative. She writes, liberation, whose fruits are absence of restraint and possession of power of locomotion, is indeed a condition of freedom. Nobody would ever be able to arrive at a place where freedom rules if he could not move without restraint. Which is to say that where necessity and coercion rule, there can be no freedom prior to some degree of liberation. Accomplishing political freedom beyond mere liberation, however, requires that people establish a constitution. And that's basically what we don't have. The point of establishing a constitution is that by simultaneously binding people together across a considerable length of time, establishing power potential on a relatively large scale, and explicitly creates room for distinction among individuals. That is, constitutions create mechanisms of recognition for the political equality we call citizenship. Unfortunately, and here's very important to look at the distinction between what we have now. We don't have citizenship anymore. Citizenship requires that you have some investment within the constitutional structure, you have some investment within the agora, some investment within the public sphere. With that investment comes up the right to vote. So in the ancient Greek societies, the investment is that you would send your sons off to battles, and then you can have a right to vote. Or you are a soldier and you're going to go off to battle, you're going to put your life on the line, or you're going to say something in public speech that's going to affect your social order. That is your vote. That is how you get a vote. In our society, you get a vote willy-nilly. You get a vote willy-nilly without any need to participate or give back to your community. You get a vote because you exist. And not only that, even worse is just because you're born here without having any participation, just because you're born somewhere, you get a vote. That is a North American thing. It's a Western settler colonial thing. And that creates a culture of, I don't owe you anything, I have no emotional labor investment in my community, I don't need, and that's exactly what community needs. A community needs what? It needs unpaid emotional labor. It is achieved strictly through equality before the law. Through this equalization, and only in this equalization does the distinction given by birth appear, because it enables humans to see distinctions among common humans and not just sheer otherness of different kinds of beings. As a citizen, a human being is acknowledged as belonging to a community, yet separate from her peers in ways that warrant protection and respect through the institutional rights that limits what others can do to her and allows her to have a say in public matters. Politics is not about defending your public say anymore. It's about making sure you are repeating the idioms. And that's in our schools, in our psychology, in our judicial system. Everything is forcing us to repeat the same intersectional ideology. And if we don't, well, you're going to have to pay something. And it is the incorporation of individuals into the common status of citizenship that establishes Arendt's robust notion of freedom. This is not what we have. This is all idealism, right? What we have is nightmare. As our discussion of politics draws to a close, it will pay to note a few key features. First, politics always involves forms of dialogue and that preservation of distinction of individuals. Second, politics is that realm of political or public activity that allows humans to transform and add to their common world. No. Especially by changing. This is not the perspective of privilege, right? The perspective of privilege is I don't owe you anything. I don't owe the world anything. Especially by changing and creating different institutions that they inhabit. These characterizations give us criteria to determine what counts as politics for Arendt and helps to clarify how government force is different from political power.